Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. We were off last week, and I hope you had an enjoyable Hanukkah and New Year break. Listen to this. A model, a comedian, and a makeup influencer walk into Israel's foreign ministry. No, it's not a joke. It's part of how Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar is trying to formulate a new public diplomacy, or hasbara, strategy for Israel. This is the opening line to an article that dropped over the weekend on Jewish Insider by Lahav Harkov, the news site's senior political correspondent who covers Israel's domestic and international politics. In the article, Lahav detailed how Gideon Sa'ar, the new foreign minister, managed to secure a budget for public diplomacy, what we often refer to as hasbara, of $150 million, over 20 times what it was before the war began in 2023. The question is, what does Gideon Sa'ar plan to do with all this money? And that's what Lahav is trying to figure out in the article. So far, as she tells us, he's been meeting with influencers, YouTubers, models, comedians, as well as some heads of the different Jewish NGOs that operate in the hasbara space. He's been listening, taking notes, and thinking. And while this is an impressive amount of money that can make a big difference, I discuss with Lahav whether it will be enough, and if it can really make a dent when there are still fundamental structural flaws to the way the state does PR. Finally, before I let Lahav go, I had to ask her about Secretary of State Antony Blinken's comments over the weekend to the New York Times. Basically, where Secretary Blinken says how Hamas is to blame for there not being a hostage deal. Not Israel, but Hamas. Not Netanyahu, but Hamas. Why now? And what does Antony Blinken hope to achieve with these comments? Here we go. Hey, Lahav, great to have you back on the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me on.
Of course. So we're talking about a model, a comedian, and a makeup influencer who all walk together into the foreign ministry. And that is the opening. That's not Yaakov Katz making up a joke, because that would not be good. But that's the opening line to a great article that you wrote the other day in the Jewish Insider, talking about basically this new overhaul hasbara, or public diplomacy program, that the foreign minister, Gideon Sa'ar, who's now been in the job, maybe 2 months or so, has planned for the state of Israel. So I'd love for you to walk us through what exactly is Gideon Sa'ar planning, how much money is on the table, and what does a comedian, an influencer, and a model, have anything to do with all of this?
So Gideon Sa'ar, longtime Likud minister who then left Likud in a big fight with Netanyahu, joined the coalition. There was also a lot of drama in and out of the coalition in the last year, but most importantly, he joined the coalition in November and became foreign minister. And one of the conditions in joining the coalition was that the foreign ministry would get the equivalent of $150 million for what Israelis call hasbara, what's better called public diplomacy.
Which is just about, it's about half a billion shekel or so, right?
Right. Turns out he didn't have a plan of what to do with it. He just had this idea, what we're doing is bad and it's underfunded, and he wants to throw a lot of money at the problem. In order to come up with a plan, he invited, or his staff invited, just all kinds of people who are dealing with sort of Israel advocacy. So there was a day that was sort of, I wrote in the article that it was an influencer's day. That's what I called it, as sort of a shorthand. Some people were like a little offended by it. It was sort of individuals who are big on social media. Maybe not all of them are professional influencers, but people advocating for Israel social media was one of the days. Another day was the head of organizations that had some sort of part in advocating for Israel, from big organizations like the Jewish Agency to smaller organizations like Honest Reporting. And there's supposed to be other days going on. There's supposed to be Spanish and Arabic and just other categories as well. And it's just brainstorming sessions. And what I heard from people in those first two sessions is that Gideon Sa'ar really was sitting there, listening, taking notes, sometimes asking questions if he had them, but that it really was just a listening session. And they said that as a positive thing. They liked that there's a minister who's coming and actually hearing what they've learned and they've understood, because many of them have been doing this for years, if not decades. Now, the funny part of the article is that among the influencer types were also people who have only been doing this for the past year. And, they think that they have single-handedly caused countries to stop funding UNRWA, for example. They have sort of an inflated idea, or they think that they've, discovered something that all these other people who have been working in this for years have known for a long time. So there's a bit of a tension in the room. There's a little bit of sort of gossipy tidbits in the article, which if you're interested, I can talk about.
Oh no, I definitely am interested, because I'm interested also in some who these people are. Like, I read there's some names there, like Ashley Waxman Bakshi, who's some YouTuber, Israeli model Natalie Dadon, comedian Yochai Sponder. I don't know that these are names. You mentioned in the article also, and just now, I mean, there's organizations, Honest Reporting, the World Zionist Organization, Nefesh B'Nefesh, NGO Monitor, and Stand With Us. Like, these are the people who I think most of the world, or most of the people who, like you and I, let's say, kind of dabble within the hasbara world, are familiar with. But who are these YouTuber comedian models?
Well, so a lot of them are the names you said. So like Ashley Waxman Bakshi, she's Canadian. I don't remember if she's Canadian, a child of Israelis, or if she's Canadian and she married an Israeli. She's been living in Israel for like 20 years or something, but grew up in Canada. And she started a YouTube channel with these like makeup tutorials that you see all over on social media. And she started doing hasbara type stuff. I believe she was doing it before October 7th already. It's not professional, but she is a fluent English speaker, which gives her advantage over a lot of the people based in Israel doing this kind of stuff. And I think she's someone who has put in a lot of hard work in this area. You have Yochai Sponder, who's an Israeli comedian who works a lot in English and goes abroad and does, you see him doing like clubs in New York. I can't say that I've done the level of research to know if it's open mic night or whether he actually has his own nights at these comedy clubs, but I have heard of some of the comedy clubs who are in the background of his videos. And
he's quite funny.
Funny
also.
guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he does like topical humor often that has to do with the war and things like that. And I didn't speak to him directly. He didn't respond to me when I reached out to him, but from people who were in the room, they said that he actually had sort of insightful things to say about non-traditional ways of reaching out to different audiences. And then there's Natalie Dadon, who's an Israeli model. She's like outspoken right-wing, has like spoken in right-wing rallies in Israel and things like that. And I guess she's doing hasbara videos since October 7th. Frankly, like, these other people, I don't consider them big celebrities, but like the algorithm brought them to me at some point over the years. Over the last year, I had seen them, I had heard of them. Natalie Dadon, the algorithm never brought her to me. I had heard of her when she spoke at a pro-Bibi rally last year before the war. I had heard of her as a model in Israel, but when I was doing this article, I was like, really, she's doing hasbara? And I think, not to pick on her in particular, because I heard that there are some other people like this as well. There are some people, some Israelis, who think that they're doing hasbara for the world, but they're really just doing videos for other Israelis. Like, they just don't have the right references, way of talking about things. Maybe their English isn't good enough, or maybe their Spanish isn't good enough, because apparently there's someone there who said he was doing hasbara in Spanish because he learned Spanish from watching telenovelas. And they seem to be working a lot more for clout in Israel, whether intentionally or not. So it's, I hope that in the case of these influencers, that SAR knows how to separate sort of the wheat from the chaff and can see who had actually serious things to say and who didn't.
Natalie Dadon, sorry, I can't say I know her too well either, but I've had the chance to look at her Twitter page today before the conversation you and I are having, and did notice very pro-Bibi, very critical of the people who are critical of Bibi. And not to mention the fact that in your own article, you mention how she called for censorship of the Israeli press.
Yeah. everyone I talked to who was in that meeting was appalled that that's what she called for. Look, I share her frustration at the way certain Israelis report certain things. Like, I get where she's coming from, but she's completely misguided in what the solution is, right? And I think Gideon Sa'ar himself sort of put her in her place, saying, like, first let's try to get the soldiers to stop posting videos from Gaza on TikTok, and then we can move to, bigger targets.
So, Lahav, I mean, the article didn't necessarily touch on this, but I'm curious what you're hearing and also kind of what you're thinking. If Gideon Sa'ar does have about a 500 million shekel budget, which is about $150 million, which is a significant amount of money, I could go off on a tangent to talk about how they're giving a ton of money to all these ministries at a time that they're just raising taxes for us average Israelis, but we'll put that aside. That'll be for another podcast episode. But what should he do with the money? I mean, to bring Natalie Dadon and Yochai Splendor and the heads of all these different organizations, that's all great and good, but that's a lot of money that you could do a lot of things differently. But really, the way I kind of view it is at the core, the root, the foundation of the way the whole government is set up, is that's the problem, right? It's not, we need more influencers or Spanish, French, or English.
Look, I think it's like a little bit of both, right? I think this government is not doing itself any favors internationally. But when we had a briefly had a different looking government, it wasn't like all of a sudden the people who hated Israel were like singing Kumbaya with us because Naftali Bennett was prime minister, or for 6 months Yair Lapid. So I think that this is a constant need, regardless of whether, Ben Gvir and Smotrich are in the government or not. That doesn't give them a pass on, having ministers who say things like we need to drop a nuclear bomb on Gaza, and all kinds of other really awful things that they said, and they didn't mean it, right? Sometimes they say awful things they mean, but they didn't mean dropping a nuclear bomb. So like think twice before you speak, right? But I think like it is worth investing on good public diplomacy, even if the challenges might be compounded at the moment. And to me, I think one of the top things that they need to spend their money on is they need to choose key countries around the world and bring in the best public relations firms and have crisis PR come in and try to improve Israel's brands in those countries. They need the best professionals. They need the people who deal with this all the time, dealing with clients who are in crisis, whose names are being dragged through the mud. Because I think that diplomats are not trained to do that. Sometimes they do good things. Like, there are some diplomats who have been very good at this over the years. But I think right now what we need is crisis PR.
What about the fact that the prime minister doesn't have a foreign press spokesperson, hasn't had one really officially since the beginning of the war, doesn't have somebody who's running what's known in Hebrew as the Mateh Hasbara Lumi, the National Information Directorate, which is the body of the prime minister's office that is meant to coordinate between all of the different ministries and all the different spokespeople and all the different agencies, IDF, police, Shabak, Mossad, etc. I mean, it seems always to me, and I was getting that feeling a bit from your article, which was kind of giving the inside view of what's been happening at these seminars that Gideon Sa'ar has been holding, is that they're very nice, but they're dealing with the very superficial level. Like, that surface of where you have a comedian and a YouTuber who, they'll rack up maybe 500,000, 1 million views. Most of them will be the Jewish ghetto. Some might be outside, so you might change some hearts and minds, but mostly you're just preaching to the choir. But the whole structure in the government is broken. I mean, why not focus on that to some extent?
Yeah, I agree. I have written about that in the last year. And I think it's a huge problem, right? And on both levels. Bibi needs a foreign press spokesperson who's holding regular press conferences. It doesn't have to be every day like in the beginning of the war. But somebody who English-speaking media can reach out to, or just non-Hebrew-speaking media can reach out to, right? And there really isn't anyone like that. I mean, there is someone who's like that, but who's sort of not authorized and not privy to anything. It takes him hours because he has to get so many permissions, And
he's a nice guy,
there should
but
be
he's
someone
just not in the
who's
know.
more senior.
Right.
He's a great guy. Exactly. Has been there since Ehud Barak was prime minister. So, right, you need to have someone more senior, somebody who's personally appointed by Netanyahu, who Netanyahu trusts, and can give real information to people. And I agree about the Mata hasbara, which is supposed to coordinate between all the different bodies that are giving some kind of public statement that the government needs to be on message. And Israel has historically been very bad at this, staying on message. You know, they'll have 5 different messages at the same time. And I think another part of the problem, you know, the IDF spokesman's unit is very good at its job most of the time. At least good at its job internationally, I think most of the time. It makes some mistakes and big ones. You and I have talked about it before, but overall, they're very professional. That being said, just the fact that people in uniform are the ones speaking for Israel all the time doesn't make Israel look good. It makes us look like this overly militarized society. We should have people who are civilians talking to the world about what's going on in Israel, and not just Daniel Hagari, who's good. You know, like I think he does a good job most of the time. Again, has made mistakes, but is good. But he just shouldn't be the main person.
What do you think the chances are that whatever Gideon Sa'ar does makes any big difference? I mean, one of the thoughts that I had with that kind of money is you have about 100 different embassies, consulates around the world. Just give each of them $500,000 shekel to do something with, $1 million shekel to actually engage with their local constituents, and that would make a difference.
Yes, I think that would be helpful, but I think that would also have to be coordinated. You need someone who's on top of it, you know, of like, what is Israel's message? What does Israel's image want to be? And to not completely change it, but to tailor it and tinker with it slightly country to country based on what appeals to people in different countries. And, or, you know, types of populations and things like that. And once you have that, maybe some of the funding could and should trickle down to the different embassies so that they can individually figure out ways to use that message. But I think that they really need to like look at Israel as a product or a brand that they need to market now in a very professional way. I think that was always the case, but I think like the need is much more acute now than it has been in a long time.
By the way, when I mentioned the fact that we should give money to the local embassies and consulates, just so people understand, the way it often works is like if you're the consul general to Shanghai or the consul general to Chicago, you have to raise money from the local Jewish community to even hold a Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day celebration, right? There's basically no budget that you're given from the state of Israel, which is a little ridiculous that this is the reality. Lahav, I do want to switch gears for a moment because I do have you, and I want to talk about Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's comments over the weekend to the New York Times, which were quite interesting because, and you know, I know you've been covering this very closely. Obviously the hostage talks as well as the U.S.-Israel relationship is always something that you're on top of. But Secretary Blinken, who's leaving office in just 2 weeks or so, spoke about how basically it was Hamas that has backtracked on agreeing to a hostage deal all along, that every time that they came close to a deal, it was Hamas that pulled away. American pressure on Israel would make Hamas think, oh, we should pull back because America will get the job done, or we'll be on the brink of a larger confrontation in the region, so we'll pull away from there. And then he even went as far as to say what's shocking is how everyone's quick to criticize Israel, but where is the world in demanding that Hamas stand down and give back the hostages? So I'm curious to ask you 2 questions. One is, why now, and why is he saying this? And B is, where is this coming from? I mean, like, this has not been the Blinken that I think most of us have heard or seen over the last 15 months or so of this war.
Yeah, it is really interesting because it's like, it seems like the Biden administration has learned this lesson very, very late in the game. Suddenly they know the thing that, I mean, Israelis have been saying since Barack Obama became president in 2009, that when you openly have daylight between Israel and the U.S., it helps the bad guys. And so now it's specifically the case with the hostage deal. But I would say the thing that he said, that Hamas is the one sabotaging the deal or turning away from the deal again and again, I think the Biden administration has been consistent for a while in saying that. I'm not sure if I could put my finger on the exact point at which they've been saying that, but it's been, I think, since the summer, really. So he's consistent on that point, but it's interesting. Like I said, like it took him this long. It took him 4 years to learn the lesson, or you could say the entire war. I will say it took him a year and a few months to learn the lesson that the way the Biden administration was speaking, maybe starting from the end of 2023, not immediately after the war started, but the way they were speaking was not actually having the effect they wanted. I don't know, maybe he feels freer of electoral constraints, right? That he doesn't feel like he has to care as much about the pressure from within the like left wing of the Democratic Party to some extent. I think that Biden feels freer in that way. Like, I think the fact that Biden has said and done very little having to do with Israel since the election has to do with that. So maybe Blinken's willingness to really say, like, it is all Hamas's fault, actually, is part of that.
What do you think, though, as they kind of leave office, or as the Biden administration winds down and their time comes to an end, the impact this will have? Because here in Israel, for example, we were talking about public diplomacy before, but the media here has really taken a completely different approach, right? The Israeli media has constantly criticized Netanyahu as being the obstacle to a deal, and not Hamas, right? So I think if you, almost as if I would go out on a limb and say, if you were to ask the average Israeli, why isn't there a deal? They would say, oh, what do you mean? Netanyahu doesn't want to end the war. He wants the war to continue for political survival. Here comes Blinken and says, no, that's not true.
You think the average Israeli would say that?
I don't know.
I don't think so, actually.
No?
I feel like the average Israeli is not so. I think they think the war is just.
The average journalist, then.
I don't know.
Let's say that.
The average journalist, for sure,
For sure.
100%. And I do think to some look, it fits the pre-existing narrative, the pre-war narrative of most journalists in Israel, and they're also taking cues from the hostage families, who I don't judge, but that's what they're saying. And very early in the war, like December, January, when I was speaking to hostage families, they were saying, look, these are the people we can influence. We don't have an influence on Hamas. You know, they were traveling all over the world and speaking with other governments, but they said the only people who we can protest really is this government. So I think it's like, well, what would you have them do? You know what I mean? Like, I almost said it's misguided, because I do think that ultimately it wasn't so helpful. But on the other hand, like, what else can they do, right? They want to feel like they're doing something for their loved ones. So you can't judge. But the media, I think, should be more responsible in the way they report it. And I had tweeted earlier this morning that, you know, this thing that Blinken said, which is so simple and true, and I think we've known it's true for at least 6 months, you know, people who had more trust in Netanyahu probably have known it all along. And that truth is covered in all these layers of scandal, right? There's this whole thing with Eli Feldstein, who was like one of Netanyahu's spokespeople, who was arrested because he was involved in passing information basically that proved that this is Sinwar's thinking from the IDF to Netanyahu, right? And so we just keep talking about this scandal about these couple of people who went to jail because of information security in the IDF. Or if you're in England, you just keep talking about how a journalist used a fake name and got an article published in the Jewish Chronicle, right? But in the end, these are true things. These are real things that are happening in the negotiation. And all we talk about are these scandals, instead of what's really going on in those talks.
Why is that,
right?
So why is that the case?
When it comes to Israeli media, right, the mainstream Israeli media is very, very critical of Netanyahu, and everyone has their own different ways of being critical of Netanyahu, right? But that's the average, you know, viewpoint of an Israeli media person, you know, and you always have a few people who see it otherwise. Not in Haaretz, as I said, but, you know, on Channel 12, Channel 13 less so, but they're there, you know, Channel 11, and Channel 14 is just the pro-Netanyahu channel, so sometimes there you'll have a token person who doesn't like Netanyahu as much. But the viewpoint was expressed that, no, actually it's Hamas who's, torpedoing these talks. But it was not the dominant view because of the politics.
Everything is looked at through the Netanyahu prism, and unfortunately, what that does, I think, is it taints the whole conversation, but it also makes people maybe put the weight of the pressure on the wrong side or the wrong place, for that matter.
Right. Well, it's the BB derangement syndrome.
A different form of BDS. Although in America now they're suffering from something called TDS, right? The Trump derangement syndrome. And on that question, on that point, I did want to ask you, does Trump, if you had to guess, if you had a crystal ball right now with kind of 2 weeks or so left, a little over 2 weeks left till Trump takes office, do you think that there is any, if this is a window of opportunity for a hostage deal, or is it going to be something that's going to roll over to Trump's term? And if so, does Trump have more leverage than Joe Biden?
I would think that Hamas would want to get this deal done before Trump came into office, because the Biden administration would be less tough on them in theory. In practice, who knows? But in theory. On the other hand, I'm not entirely sure what leverage Trump has that would work on Hamas to release the hostages, right? Like it's like the only thing that, or among the only things that Hamas has left. Maybe Trump would allow Israel to, have less aid come into Gaza. But anyway, so much aid is coming into Gaza, and there's just trucks parked there by the Rafah crossing, and nobody's getting that food. So it's like the Gazans are starving anyway, basically, and Hamas doesn't care. So I don't know what leverage Trump has, even though I think that Trump's attitude will probably be, let's get him.
Yeah, well, we'll have to wait to see. We'll hold on to our chairs for another two and a half weeks or so. Lahav Harkov, senior correspondent for Jewish Insider and a frequent guest on the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. Thanks for joining us in today's episode. You can find us, as always, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and, of course, the website of Times of Israel. We look forward to seeing you